Many people have difficulty in relating to today's gospel reading. Jesus is telling us to turn the other cheek when someone strikes us, to go the extra mile when we really don't have to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. It would appear that Jesus is endorsing a passive way of life. But is that really what he means? Let's move a little further on in the gospel. Imagine you're standing in the temple in Jerusalem and Jesus shows up. Based on today's gospel reading, you might very well miss him. Jesus is there, but he's not the one with the prayer book. He's not showing any degree of passiveness. Actually, he's the one overturning the tables and yelling at the merchants. And if you want to jump over to the Gospel of John for a more detailed description, Jesus is the one with the whip. Yet in the temple, Jesus never lost his temper. He never held a grudge. He never had contempt. He never got angry. He simply went about his business and cleansed his Father's temple. And at the end of the day, he probably loved and forgave those merchants just like anyone else. The message of love that Jesus delivers today is not a message of being passive or a suggestion to tolerate exploitation or abuse. Rather, his message is an invitation to not retaliate, to not exact revenge, to not hold a grudge. And if you're Irish, good luck with that. He's asking us to not let a dark, cold, hardened heart drag us down into an abyss of festering hate for another. Tom Kelly was born in Belfast, Ireland in 1955. He grew up in the inner city in some of the most troubled times in the history of Northern Ireland. By the age of 12, he was accomplished at throwing rocks at the British Army and the Protestant enemy. By the age of 16, he was accomplished at shooting at them. His first arrest came in 1973. He spent 2.5 years in Long Kesh internment camp. Upon his release, he resumed his old ways of violence and killing, only this time with much more fervor. In 1977, he was again incarcerated, this time for attempted murder on a British soldier. He was sentenced to 7.5 years in the H-Block prison, where the only thing each man had in his cell was a Bible and a blanket. The prisoners were stripped of all clothing and allowed to wrap themselves in a blanket only, perhaps to instill some humility in them, or perhaps to deter a prison break. Finally, in 1982, 5 years after being imprisoned, Tom returned home to a jubilant welcome. In the days and weeks that followed his release, this 27-year-old man started some personal soul-searching. He reflected on his Bible readings while interned in that horrible prison. And he struggled with many of the readings, certainly with the reading that we heard today. He asked himself what he really had achieved so far in his life. He had developed hatred. He had been involved in killings. He had animosity towards the Protestants of Northern Ireland. But most of all, he had an emptiness in his heart that he just couldn't relate to. He didn't know it then, but Tom lacked the ability to forgive, to care, or to love. Around that time, Tom met his future wife, Catherine. She encouraged him to join her on numerous interdenominational religious retreats. It was on one of these retreats that Tom came face to face with Jim. Just like Tom, Jim had been incarcerated in Northern Ireland for his part in the violent religious struggle. Jim, however, was Protestant. Jim had been a member of the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, the arch enemy of the Catholic-based IRA. Jim suffered from the same exact internal empty feelings that Tom continued to experience. Tom and Jim made amends at that retreat. They hugged each other, forgave each other, and acknowledged the true human worth in each one. In the years prior to their meeting, Tom and Jim would have been vicious enemies that battled in the streets of Belfast, each with the hope of taking the other's life. Tom had to travel a bit of road before he discovered that the real prison for him was not Longcash internment camp or the H-Block prison, but his own heart, which was captive to all manner of prejudice, fear, hatred, resentment, and unforgivingness. The message from Jesus today is not a message of passive resistance. It is a message of being in control of our lives, which in turn will control our destiny. It is a message of not being dominated by the anger or resentment for another, but rather forgiving and simply moving on. In ancient times, it was said that all roads lead to Rome. For the Christian, all roads, we pray, lead to heaven. Those roads that we travel on our journey home can be paved with forgiveness and a willingness to go an extra mile, as Jesus asks of us today, or they can be paved with resentment, hard feelings, bitterness, and a non-willingness to forgive, resulting in a rough journey with no guarantee that we will survive those roads to make it to our final destination. We must choose how our road is to be paved. Jesus' command to us today is not an easy one to comply with, but we can take encouragement from him who not only forgave his enemies at Calvary, but actually made an excuse for their conduct on their behalf when he said, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." Could we offer those same words of forgiveness to another?